It was a rainy afternoon when Officer Nate Callahan first saw the dog, limping along the edge of a quiet industrial park, soaked to the bone, one ear torn and the other twitching toward every sound, like he expected the world to hurt him again. And for some reason, Nate pulled the cruiser over without thinking, something in his chest tightening at the sight of the matted fur, the sunken ribs, and most of all, the eyes that looked far too human in their exhaustion. The German Shepherd froze when the door opened, body stiff with distrust, but didn't run. He just stared, rain dripping from his chin, as if weighing whether the man in uniform was like the others who had shouted or thrown rocks or worse. Nate lowered himself to a crouch, tossing a piece of his sandwich onto the wet pavement between them, not too close, just enough to show peace, and whispered, "You're safe now, buddy." The dog didn't move at first. Then, slowly, with a limp that made Nate wince, he crept forward and took the food, eyes never leaving Nate's face. That's how it began. Nate named him Shadow, partly because of the way he followed quietly from that day forward, and partly because he understood things Nate hadn't said aloud in years. Nate, a 10-year officer with no family left, no spouse, just a quiet apartment, and an old photo of his late K-9 partner on the wall, hadn't expected to open his heart again. But Shadow made it impossible not to. The dog healed slowly, both physically and emotionally, startled at first by sirens, flinching at raised voices, hiding under tables during storms. But each time Nate was there, patient and still, never forcing, just offering space and steady presence until the tremors stopped. Soon, Shadow began to trust him, not just as a rescuer, but as home. What shocked Nate most wasn't how well Shadow responded to care. It was how he responded to pain in others. At accident scenes, Shadow would sit beside victims in shock, gently resting his head against them without command. In tense domestic calls, he would quietly position himself between Nate and raised voices, like a living barrier of calm. And when Nate had nightmares, those nights when the ghosts of past failures visited in vivid color, it was Shadow who nudged him awake, pressed close until his breathing slowed. They were both healing, not in grand heroic gestures, but in everyday grace. Morning walks through silent streets, shared breakfasts, evenings watching rain from the same porch where Nate had once stood alone. Shadow, it turned out, hadn't just been rescued. He was rescuing right back, piece by piece, paw by paw. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of those days, Nate realized something he hadn't dared believe in a long time. This broken, beautiful dog hadn't just survived. He had come home. It had been 6 months since Shadow limped into Nate's life, and though the scars on the shepherd's body had faded to faint reminders beneath his thickening coat, the ones inside, the cautious way he still checked a room before fully entering, the instinctive flinch when a stranger raised their hand too quickly, told a deeper story. Yet through it all, Shadow had become more than a companion to Nate. He had become a presence in the small-town police department itself, a silent sentinel in the squad room, laying calmly beside the dispatch desk, or following Nate through the halls with a steady gaze and a quiet, anchoring calm that no one could ignore. It was a Friday morning when they brought in the boy, no older than 9, found hiding behind a gas station dumpster, dirty, shivering, and mute. His name was Eli. They couldn't get a word out of him. Not the officers, not the social worker, not even the kind receptionist who knelt and offered him cocoa with both hands. He just sat in the corner, knees to chest, eyes fixed on the floor like, if he blinked, the world would fall apart again. Nate watched from across the room, heart sinking. He'd seen that look before. On Shadow, on himself. So he knelt down beside the shepherd and simply said, "Let's try." As they entered the room, Eli tensed, but when Shadow padded forward and stopped halfway, sitting quietly with ears down and tail still, the boy looked up. Their eyes met, one pair wide and terrified, the other calm and knowing, and after a long, motionless beat, Eli slowly reached out a hand, not to touch, not yet, just to be seen. Shadow didn't move, just stayed, silent, present, real. Within 5 minutes, Eli had slid down from his chair and inched closer. Within 10, he was sitting beside the dog, leaning slightly against his side. No words, just warmth. By the end of the week, Eli was asking if Shadow would be there tomorrow. Over the next month, Eli came in regularly while his case was sorted, sometimes for interviews, sometimes just to sit and color in the corner with a juice box, but only if Shadow was there. And Nate didn't mind. In fact, he started adjusting his shift hours for it, because every time he saw Eli resting against Shadow, some of the boy's fear melting into soft smiles and quiet hums, he remembered what it felt like to be seen without being pushed, comforted without words. It wasn't therapy, it wasn't training, it was just truth, that some dogs are born with a kind of quiet wisdom humans can only wish to understand. One night, as Nate and Shadow walked home under a deep blue sky, Eli's social worker called. He asked if Shadow could come visit when he goes to his new foster home, she said softly. "I think it would help him sleep." Nate looked down at the shepherd, trotting beside him, his steps steady and sure now, ears flicking with every distant sound. "Yeah," he said after a pause. "We'll be there." And so they were, not just for Eli, but for others who came through the station in the weeks that followed. A girl who hadn't spoken since the fire, a teenager arrested for stealing food, shaking with hunger and shame. Shadow sat with them all, no barking, no tricks, just that quiet, unshakable presence that seemed to say, "You're not alone anymore." And on the evenings when the station emptied out and the world grew quiet, Nate would sit on the back steps of the building, coffee in one hand, Shadow curled beside him, and feel something settle inside him that he hadn't known how to name before. Peace. Because he had rescued a broken dog once. But that dog had done something even greater. He had stayed, and in staying, he was teaching others to believe they were worth saving too. Shadow had become something of a quiet legend in the precinct, not officially trained, not sworn in, but respected more than some of the officers on the force. He had a way about him that no badge could grant. Children opened up when he was near. Elderly victims of fraud smiled again when he curled under their chairs. Officers coming off hard shifts found themselves instinctively reaching down to scratch his ears. Nate didn't ask for it, didn't push it. He simply brought Shadow along when it felt right, and it always felt right. But it was a stormy Thursday when everything changed. A call came through about a missing girl, 10 years old, wandered from a community picnic near the state park. Search teams were already forming when Nate arrived, rain soaking through his jacket, and the fear in the air was like static, tight, breathless, electric. Shadow sat in the back seat, watching Nate through the rearview mirror like he always did, ears alert. Nate hadn't brought him expecting anything, but something in his gut shifted. "You ready, partner?" he asked softly. Shadow responded by standing and pressing his head to Nate's shoulder the moment the door opened. They joined the others, Nate following the last known path, Shadow sniffing, not trained to search but led by something else entirely. The trail was thin, nearly erased by wind and water. After 20 minutes, hope had started to crack in everyone's eyes. but not in shadows. He stopped near a cluster of rocks, ears stiff, head tilted. Then, without a sound, he veered off the trail into dense brush, Nate calling after him, trying to keep up. They moved deeper into the woods, Nate ducking branches, sliding on mud, until Shadow halted beside a fallen log near a gnarled oak and let out a low whine. Nate caught up, heart hammering, flashlight beam sweeping until it froze on a small pink sneaker sticking out from behind the trunk. "Maya," he breathed. A tiny whimper answered. The girl was curled under the tree, shivering, scraped and soaked, her lips blue from cold. She blinked up at Nate but reached toward Shadow, who had already pressed close, his body warming hers, his nose gently nudging her arm. "I was trying to find my brother's old fort," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Then I got lost." Nate radioed it in, wrapped her in his jacket, but it was Shadow she clung to during the ride back. One hand buried in his fur, her trembling finally starting to fade. After that day, something shifted. Word spread. Not just in the department, but in town. Shadow wasn't just Nate's dog anymore. He was the dog who found Maya. The dog who understood. The local school invited them in for a visit. Hospitals asked for appearances. A small therapy center in the next town called to ask if Shadow might visit children with trauma. Nate said yes to every request. Not out of pride, but because he knew what it meant to have something to hold on to when the world had turned cold. And as the months passed, Nate began writing down everything. Every child Shadow helped, every officer whose hand lingered a little longer on his back, every life touched by the quiet loyalty of a dog once discarded and alone. Shadow, once broken and lost, had become more than a rescued soul. He was a rescuer now, not with teeth or speed, but with presence, with patience, with love. The kind that didn't ask for anything back, only a place to belong and someone to sit beside while the storm passed. Nate had never been good at talking about the past. He wore silence like armor, thin enough to function, thick enough to hide behind. People in town called him solid, dependable, the guy who never cracks. But the truth was, he had cracked years ago. Not loudly, quietly, when his brother never came home from the army, when the letters stopped, when no answers came. That grief had settled into Nate's bones, reshaping the way he smiled, the way he trusted, the way he walked into a room and never let his back face the door. Even after years of service, even after promotions, the ache never softened. Until Shadow. At first, it was little things. The way the dog sat beside him on those sleepless nights when the house was too quiet and the coffee tasted like ash. The way he'd rest his head on Nate's knee during the long, grey evenings when memories came uninvited. Nate had rescued Shadow from the side of a dirt road, wounded and shaking, a sack of bones with eyes that didn't ask for anything, just waited. But he hadn't known, in that moment, that Shadow would one day return the favor. It was on the anniversary of his brother's death when it truly hit. Nate hadn't mentioned the date to anyone, didn't take the day off, just showed up for duty like always. But his stomach was in knots, his mind looping old images. A goodbye at the train station, a voice on the phone saying, "I'll be back before football season." He went through the motions, filed reports, handled dispatch, smiled faintly at his partner's joke. But inside, he was sinking. He drove out to the Overlook that evening, the place where his brother used to take him after hard days, when the town looked small and the stars looked close enough to touch. Nate sat on the hood of his cruiser, hands in his jacket, staring out across the hills, trying to breathe around the weight in his chest. He didn't notice Shadow slip out of the back seat until he felt a nudge against his leg. Then Shadow jumped up beside him, not something he usually did, and rested his head firmly on Nate's shoulder like an anchor. No sound, no movement, just that familiar, steady presence. Nate let out a shaky breath, then another, and then, quietly, almost ashamed, he whispered, "I miss him every damn day." Shadow leaned in closer, and for the first time in years, Nate let the tears fall. Not because he was weak, but because, finally, someone was strong enough to sit with him through it. From that night forward, Nate started showing up a little differently. He spoke more openly at the department's quiet wellness meetings. He helped start a small support group for first responders who had lost someone in the line of duty. And when they asked him why, what had changed, he just smiled and looked at Shadow, curled at his feet. "Because he stayed," he'd say. "When I didn't know how to, Shadow was more than a companion now. He was a bridge between past and present, between silence and healing. And every life they touched together, every child comforted, every person reached, was another thread in the invisible bond that had saved them both." It was late October when the letter arrived. Not a call, not an email, but an actual letter, hand-delivered in an envelope bearing a veteran's hospital seal. Nate opened it slowly, the edges already softened by the fingerprints of the man who'd written it. It was from Sergeant Paul Drennan, a retired Marine struggling with PTSD, now working part-time with a veteran support center just outside the city. The letter was simple, but direct. "I've heard about Shadow, about what you do. We've got a man here who's not speaking. He's been here 2 months and hasn't said a word. They say he lost his unit in a roadside blast, but no one knows the full story. He doesn't trust people. But I think maybe he'd trust a dog." Nate didn't hesitate. He folded the letter neatly, looked down at Shadow sleeping on the floor, and said, "You ready, boy?" Shadow stood instantly, ears forward, like he already knew. The hospital was cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Nate recognized it. The sterile quiet, the echoes of boots down empty halls. They were led to a room at the far end of the wing. Inside sat a young man, early 20s maybe, body rigid in a wheelchair, face gaunt, eyes blank. His name was Danny. He didn't move when Nate entered, didn't look up when the staff introduced them. Nate didn't force it. He simply stepped aside, let Shadow walk in without command. The dog approached slowly, one paw at a time, ears relaxed, tail low, stopping just beside Danny's chair. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, Danny's eyes flicked downward. Shadow sat, waited. No commands, no tricks, just presence. It was almost 20 minutes before Danny moved, his hand shifting just slightly, fingertips brushing Shadow's fur. Nate saw it. And so did Paul, watching through the window. The next day, Nate returned. And the next. On the 4th day, when Shadow entered, Danny's hand was already out. On the 6th day, he whispered something Nate couldn't quite hear. And by the 2nd week, Nate found himself sitting across from Danny in the hospital courtyard, while the young man, voice still hoarse from disuse, told him what had happened in the desert, how the radio had gone out, how he'd warned his captain too late, how he'd crawled back through sand and fire with his own legs shattered just to pull one man to safety, the only one he could reach, and how no one believed him. Until now. "He believes me," Danny said, one hand resting on Shadow's head. "He never asked, just sat with me like he knew I wasn't lying." That moment shifted something, not just in Danny, but in Nate too. Because for the first time since losing his brother, he saw healing from the other side. Not just grief, but survival. And Shadow, once just a broken dog, was the thread between it all. That night, as they drove home, Nate rolled the window down, let the cool wind rush in, and glanced in the mirror at Shadow in the back seat, eyes closed, chin resting on the window edge. "You didn't just save him," Nate said softly. "You saved me too. You keep saving all of us." And from that point on, Shadow was more than a rescue. He was a lifeline, an unspoken promise that no one, no matter how lost, had to stay that way forever.